One of the most important films ever made, 111 years ago now, is A Trip to the Moon by Georges Melies. It's just 16 minutes in duration and was made 6 years after the birth of cinema. The coloured version of that film was hand-painted frame by frame and was considered lost for many years until a print was unearthed in 1993. Now this version has been restored and been released with a new soundtrack and many extras on DVD. John Byrne has been looking at that DVD. He joins me now from Limerick. Georges Melies, first of all, John, explain who he was in cinematic history and in French cinematic history.
Yeah, he was born in 1861 in Paris into a family who owned a fairly successful shoemaking business, a business that he had no interest in himself. Instead, he developed an early interest in stage magic, which is important, and in 1888 he sold his share of the business to buy the Robert Houdin Theatre in Paris, and Robert Houdin was a legendary figure in the history of magic.
What sort of things went on in that theatre?
Well, the theatre at the time was kind of in decline, even though it had been a very, very famous theatre for conjuring and magic set up by this legendary figure. But when Melies came along, he started inventing dozens of new and kind of dramatic illusions, which helped kind of revive his fortunes and bring the crowds back and make him quite famous in France. Illusions like the so-called recalcitrant decapitated man, to give it its full title, in which a professor's decapitated head won't stop talking even after it's cut off, which was a very popular illusion at the time and was performed hundreds and hundreds of times. So his background was very much in stage tricks and magic and kind of theatricality and illusion.
Now, Melies was steeped in the theatre, obviously, but a very important event in his life took place in December 1895, and this involved the Lumiere brothers. What did he see?
Yeah, well, he was present at what was the first ever paid public screening of film, of movies by the Lumiere brothers in the basement of a Parisian cafe. I think about 12 very short, 1 minute long movies were shown on that occasion. And after that, he kind of quickly realised how potent a form of entertainment film could be and how he could use it and adapt it as a tool to create ever, kind of more spectacular and amazing illusions and magic tricks.
The Lumiere brothers were certainly, it wasn't quite cinema verite, but it was sort of an actuality type of cinema. Explain the difference between what they were doing and what Melies eventually did.
Well, the early films he started making in his studio that he built in the garden of his house, I think they were distinctive in the sense that, say, while the Lumiere brothers were making actualities, as they became known, which were really just basic documentaries, very, very short, capturing, scenes of daily life, military parades, public events and all that. That's what people were pointing their cameras at and recording. Melies was really not interested in that at all. He was interested in using the new medium to just create fantasies, to build on what he was doing already, pieces of magic, tricks, illusions. So he didn't have any interest in using film in this kind of serious-minded way or in a kind of ethnographic way, if you like. It was really an extension of his own interest in magic.
But I suppose even for people going to see moving pictures in Paris or in France in the 19th century, it must have been an incredibly exciting period.
Absolutely. And I think one of the key things about Melies as well was that he really innovated, Again, it was based on his own sense of theatricality, I suppose, but there's numerous innovations that he developed that would have been the first time anybody would have seen these things on screen, like multiple exposures, which would have allowed him to have multiple versions of himself in the same scene. Like there's a famous film called The One Man Band from 1900 where he conducts a band made up entirely of versions of himself, which would have been a very startling effect at the time. And he could make characters grow and shrink and all that kind of thing.
In the one-man band, he appears playing in the orchestra or whatever it is, playing several different instruments. Is that the way he works it?
Yeah, and conducting as well. And he starred in most of his early films, in nearly all of his early films, either in disguise or just as himself.
Which happens in American in Paris, doesn't that exact same thing happen with a famous pianist later on? However, that's sidetracking.
Yeah.
The other thing that I think he discovered by accident, as often the best things are, was what we now think as the most straightforward thing in the world, stop motion.
Yeah, or the stop trick. That was what happened there was basically where you just turn the camera off, remove somebody or something from the scene, turn the camera back on, and boom, it looks like the person or thing has miraculously vanished. And that would have been quite startling at the time. And how he discovered that was he was filming a street scene in Paris, a kind of quite a Lumiere brothers type thing to do. And the camera jammed and stopped working. And by the time he got it working again, a few seconds later, obviously the traffic had moved on. So when he played the film back later, he saw, lo and behold, a carriage that he was recording had magically transformed apparently into a hearse in front of his eyes. So, very quickly he realised this is a startling new effect and he quickly realises the way it could be used for these kind of fantastical films.
And as you say, fantastical is definitely the word, not least of which is the one we're talking about this evening, A Trip to the Moon. Certainly fantastical in the 19th century.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a very basic story, really. There wasn't much story in some of these early films. It's just about an astronomer called Professor Byrne, played by Melies himself, who invites a group of his colleagues to travel with him to the moon in this rocket fired from a giant gun, which was an idea stolen from Jules Verne, from The Earth to the Moon, borrowed from Jules Verne, and. There's nothing realistic about it. I mean, they arrive at the moon and in their civvies, and they get out and they encounter these aliens called the Selenites, who are these kind of crab-like alien inhabitants of the moon, and they were performed by acrobats from the Folies Bergère.
And the Selenites are not treated well by the invading humans, it must be said.
No, and they were another borrowed concept, actually. They were lifted from H.G. Wells' First Men in the Moon. But what's interesting, I think, is this is the first ever human-alien encounter on film. And how does it pan out? Well, Professor Barbin Fouilly walks up to one of them and wallops him with his umbrella and kills it. So 2 seconds after the first encounter between humans and aliens on film, one of them is dead, namely the alien. And I think, the interesting thing about the film, as fantastical as it is, I think it's hard not to read it as a kind of a satire on the pomposity and self-importance of French academics and scientists, which is very evident. The characters are very buffoonish and comical, and a sort of satire on this very hostile and imperialist attitude to kind of the alien other, as it were.
Yeah, and the colonial argument would have been coming very much to the fore at that time as well, and it's very like that, the
Absolutely.
colonising, invading force from Earth, if you like. Now, the final scene was lost. So what has happened in this new version that we have?
Well, this was lost until about 2003, when it finally turned up, and just before that we actually see one of the Selenites dragged out, who they brought back with them, dragged out in front of the crowd and whipped by a wrangler to kind of perform like a dancing bear, which is kind of a horrible scene. But in the final scene we see this very cartoonish statue of Professor Barbin Fouilly holding his umbrella like a sword, and with his foot stamping on the face of the man in the moon like a conqueror. And it's like a very kind of goofy version of those paintings of Michael the Archangel, stamping on Satan. And I think it's not clear if Melies actually intended the film to function as a satire in that kind of way, but and the kind of drive to dominate and tame nature. But I think that final scene, particularly that kind of restored final scene, it almost makes it explicit, especially to 21st century eyes, I think.
What about Melies after? Because this was a hugely successful film. How did it treat him, and what happened in his life after that?
Well, it was very lavish production at the time, and it was very costly, 10,000 francs, which is a huge amount of money at the time. And he kind of intended it to make him famous in the US, and it did, but not necessarily in a way that did him very much good, because just after the film came out, a technician from Thomas Edison's company, which was a very powerful and very litigious company at the time, smuggled a print back to the US, and they immediately started churning out pirated copies of the film, and it was being shown all over America before Melies really knew where he was. And it was a huge hit in America, and it made Edison and a lot of other early film producers a lot of money, none of which Melies ever saw. So as a result of that, I think, and as a result of a lot of knockoffs of his movies being made by Pathé and other studios at the time, there's some very outrageous knockoffs of his films that were made, to kind of cash in on his success. His kind of fortunes declined drastically in later years. As anyone who's seen Martin Scorsese's Hugo will know, he ended up selling toys at a kiosk in the Montparnasse train station in Paris after his studio had been sold, and he was penniless, and all of his films were lost at that stage. So it was a very sad end.
And in fact, in Hugo as well, you'll see a trip to the moon being made, or a version of a trip to the moon being made in that as a fact. And I just have a text here from Paul telling me that the S is actually pronounced in Melies, so I should say Melies.
Okay,
is the way
excuse me,
I should
Paul.
say it. Seemingly, well, it's the both of us. I was saying it the other way as well. And the colouring in this film version that we see, well, not the colouring we've spoken about. In fact, we spoke with you about the colouring on Monday night around Pathé Brothers. But the soundtrack to this film, a new soundtrack has been composed.
Yeah, new soundtrack by Air, the popular French duo Air, and the film actually premiered at the 2001 Cannes Film Festival with the soundtrack attached, and quite effective, I think.
And what about the other extras on the DVD? Because presumably there's more on it than this 16-minute film.
Yeah, there's a lot of the extras are about the restoration of the film and the rediscovery of the film in 1993, just by pure chance, and it was literally the only surviving copy that was known of at the time anyway of this hand-coloured version of it, and it took about 18 years, but it was such bad shape. It took about 18 years of absolutely laborious and painstaking work for the restoration to be completed. And Hollywood, the Technicolor in Hollywood were involved, the French National Film Centre were involved, and there was a combination of digital restoration and optical restoration. So it was a really enormous process to get it back to what it is now.
So one for the cinephile,
Definitely.
if you want to have a look at it. The Georges Melies film, A Trip to the Moon, available now on DVD.